Hello, everyone, and welcome back to another episode of the War Report. Back after about a week and a half, quite a bit of news to cover, quite a bit out of Ukraine, but more so news surrounding Ukraine that could determine the direction of the war, and just the larger implications of how something like this can spill over and the ramifications it might have. Of course, we have updates about U.S.-China relations, the attempted new sanctions package, which also ties into the issue of U.S. China relations, internal European politics, possibly the UK election. We might get into that. Definitely getting into some internal politics in France and Macron's stunts lately, as we'll put them, because there's quite a bit of ground to cover with that as well. And we'll also have some updates on the Middle East and the situation out of Israel with Netanyahu's government and the uncertainty there. But without further ado, I'll hand it over to you, GSP, in order
Okay.
to give us an update on what's happening on the ground in Ukraine.
Yeah. Lots of stuff. Mercifully, thankfully, no big attacks on Russian concentration of trainees or anything like that. Crimea has successfully repelled any attacks. Um, no hit on the Kerch Bridge, but at the same time, no hit on any S-300, S-400s in that region. We remembered the last few episodes, the Ukrainians have successfully taken some of them out, both in pre-SMO Russia and in Crimea. Nothing of the sort that I've combed through. So that's good. There's news of the S500 is going to be introduced, and so this is going to have like some kind of, it's going to increase, let's say, the multi-layered protection um, that it can afford. Now, it's supposed to, if I'm not mistaken, it's supposed to be able to deal with um, it's supposed to deal with the attack him stuff as well as planes, and it really couldn't come at a better time because I'm going to send you a photo. Well, this will be the coming up now. So this Why is this important? Well, whether it's going to be NATO trained pilots or just NATO pilots, most likely NATO pilots. Like when Macron says, oh, they need 5 to 6 months of training, that's not really true. Like you need several years of being a pilot, at least 5 or 6, before you take on something like an F-16, right? You need 5 or 6 years of, sorry, 5 or 6 months to learn to fly an F-16 or another combat aircraft that's like very sophisticated, very fast. It's not it's not like you can grab somebody off the street and in 5 months I can show you how to fly an F-16. It's ridiculous.
And that's on
Anyhow,
top of the people who have the prerequisites to even begin training. Now, I know at least in the U.S., which and other major powers which have the luxury to have higher standards, they are very selective with who they let fly fighter aircraft. And Ukraine, with how whittled down its manpower pool is, especially with how vital it is to have every man they can on the front line, that pool is going to be even thinner, which, in my opinion, lends to the idea that, of course, pilots are going to be included with the next aircraft donation.
right, right. This gives you the photos I'm sending you kind of give you an idea of the terrain where they hope to introduce this. Now, the southern part of Crimea is very hilly. It's rugged. It's mountainous. And you would want these structures, these um, air defense systems stationed there, because that would help cover almost the entirety of Crimea, right? For instance, in Moscow, the Russians have already placed their air defense systems on these new structures that they've built simply for them, that are like, to me, they appear like 6, 7 stories high, right? Thereabout. And so this would follow the same logic, right? So, anyways, I thought that was kind of interesting. They're looking forward to it. Um, we're going to end off the military minutia minute, which is never a minute, but on what's happening in Kharkov, because there are certain things that are changing on the battlefield, like the American Su-39, which is a kind of glided bomb that they've begun introducing in Volchansk. And Volchansk is a very volatile space that we'll get into later. But in any case, we're in the south right now. So the photos that the screen caps that I sent you, um, the ones that I sent you initially before we began recording, you can pop that one up now. So this is the Kherson, the southern front of the battle line. This is where you have like Kherson City, the Antonovsky Bridge, Krinky. This is that whole area, and as you can see by the red pistol icons, this is initiatives attacks by the Russians. If they were blue, they would be initiatives by the Ukrainians. So there's the first one. Now, as I said earlier in the previous episodes, the Russians have managed to push the Ukrainians out of Krinky, and in some areas in the south, like across the Dnieper from Kherson City, the Russians have reestablished control over the Antonovsky Bridge. So um, here's a little bit of a close. The next photo is a close-up of the land that was captured today and the Antonovsky Bridge. So you can see southwest of the Antonovsky Bridge is that area that they've captured. And now we zoom back up, and that is the Antonovsky Bridge. So now they've got control over most of the town. And, one thing, no matter what happens in the Kharkov offensive, there are no less than a dozen towns that the Russians have managed to take because they forced the Ukrainians to redirect their resources. And I think overall, in hindsight, a lot of this was done to take whatever kind of steam that Ukraine proposed, that thought it would have, let's say in the spring, just in time for the Swiss Peace Summit, which we'll get into. Mark Rutte said something like, "Oh, they've never stood at such a strong position." No, it was not Rutte. It was I don't know, the idiot president of Finland. Um, Ukraine has never stood at such a strong position for negotiations. I'm going, are you insane? Like, it was actually stronger last year. It's actually weaker this year. But in a way, that kind of rehearsed line can indicate what the expectations might have been in April of this year for June. So, as you can see, the Russians are. It's unclear what they're doing. You can also go to the next slide in the Krinky area, which will give you an idea of Krinky is the big square just right of there. But this is that whole Krinky area. Okay, so you can see that essentially for now, from what I understand, and this is Monday night, the 17th of June. We're not seeing that could change, but Ukraine has kind of abandoned this area. For the Russians to mount an offensive here, it would be quite difficult. I don't think they're going to do it. I don't think they're at that stage where um, they're willing to risk that many lives. Putin, interestingly, said during his peace proposal, his own peace proposal, which was really just a troll. That's all it was. I don't know why people are taking it so seriously. Um, anyways, that the Russians have about 700,000 troops on the front lines. So that's it for the South. Now we move
Well,
to
what is
South.
interesting about the
Hmm.
700,000 comment is I remember, I think it was the end of last year, maybe like February, no, not February, sorry, September or October of last year. I was watching History Legends video, and he was doing the numbers. He was doing the number crunching thing that he always does, And he actually said by mid 2024 he expected there to be about 700,000 active Russian troops.
Right, right. I'm just getting rid of some of the slides because I can see it's an old slide. Okay, so um, okay, so I've readjusted that. So now we move to the next set, which is in Donetsk Central. Before I get into it, I should mention that in the Ugledar area, east of Ugledar, is a artillery pocket. It goes unusually thin and like into Russian-held territory, so to speak, right? It, but the Russians have been unable to dislodge the Ukrainians there. They've put more emphasis on Ugledar than this area. Anyhow, there are current reports by both Deep State, which is Ukrainian, and it's also now owned and run by the Ukrainian government, that something is going on there and that the Russians have taken some land. They've managed to push. I haven't seen anything there. It is a hotly contested area, which has been dormant for a very long time. RIA Novosti reporter was killed there, a young man, and another member of the crew lost his arm in that attack. So, but this is more towards Ugledar, so which happened in an area just slightly west of the area I'm talking about, but not like 100 kilometers. I'm talking a few dozen kilometers. Anyways, so now we have that slide up, and this is the Donetsk central area, and you can see what the Russians are trying to do, and that is they're trying to bifurcate a road, one that goes towards to the west to Pokrovsk, and the other one that goes northeast to Konstantinovka, or if you like, Chasiv Yar, Bakhmut. Okay, that's their main artery. That's their main supply that the Ukrainians are using. So let's take a look at that in the next slide. You can see that the Russians have made significant progress. They have captured Nova Alexandrovka. Of course, last week they already captured Solovye and I believe Sokolo or Silki, I think the Ukrainians pronounce it. It's obscured by, let me see if I can get, Sokol. Okay. So um, you can go to the next slide. So you can see that the Russians continually are making movements, expanding their area of control bit by bit. These slides that you're looking at are, I believe, a day old, or well, the first one isn't, but the second and fourth, no, the third and the fourth are, I think. Now, one of the areas that the Russians took a little while ago is Umansky, which is south of this area. As you can see, big territorial gains today in that area. Then I have the close-up of it. This is coinciding with Yasna Novobrodovka. That's the next town that what the Russians want to do is they want to push right to the limit of these two waterways, these two bodies of water. The other town that the Russians have taken, of course, they took Netalyove a little while ago, which is just south of Yasnobrodovka. And they've recaptured part of Nevelsky in the next slide. And if we go further south, yes, yeah, you can go to the next one. That's the Nevelsky that I was talking about. Netalyove and Pobeda and Nevelsky, that general area. So constant movement around there. And then we have Grigorovka. That's another town that fell. Grigorovka is south of this area, and it is south of Krasnogorovka. So there's you can see that Krasnogorovka. There have been significant gains in the southwest area. This was always this is what made expanding for the Russians difficult, because they would always be pressured But today and yesterday, actually, there was a breakthrough. The Russians, even according to Deep State, managed to take some of the apartment buildings. So, um, Constantine, it's the slide, not the slide where you have the thumbs up. It's not that one, but the one below that one.
Okay,
That's the air. Yeah,
let me find that one. That is, yeah, number 13. I had that one up. There we go. I'll put a mark on that one. So,
yeah. So that is north of the sort of the area that I'm talking about. Then the next one, this is Krasnogorovka and Grigorivka. So the Russians also managed to get into Maximyovka, but they had a foothold. They were pushed out, and now they've sort of re-entered into this area, the foothold, and that's what you're looking at there. But to return to Chasiv Yar, this is the close-up. You can see where the high rises are that the Russians have captured today. It's confirmed today, but I saw reports of this even yesterday. So these are very important because the bigger the bigger area that they've taken to the left side. After that, there's no more high rises. These are all residential. To the right, it's a significant gain. It's important, but if you look, um, the gains on the right side, these are not high rises. Okay, right next to them, of course, there are high rises. Some of them are in the gray zone, and some of them are controlled by Ukrainians. This is a very, very difficult spot. Now, fighting here lately has been very intense. Now, the Russians, of course, this was an area that they made that this was the area where the turtle tank first appeared. Last week, there was a major attack that the Russians did. They lost a lot of armor, but they still managed to make some gains. If it was not in Krasnogorovka, it was another town in Donetsk. And so uh, I'll elaborate on this later, but there is a kind of a technique that the Russians have begun using in the last month, and that is not just a turtle tank, but it's kind of like what the Russians did in Gostomel, when they took over that airport. Although it hasn't really turned out quite like they might have wanted in Volchansk. But anyways, let's keep going. And the slide below that one is the area of Grigorivka, which was a town that just fell this weekend. So the Russians, you can see that the gains are very steady. It's nonstop. I would say every 2 days, the Russians will take a village or a town somewhere. So let's now move to Chasiv Yar, where there has been a bit of back and forth. The Ukrainians have, as you can see on this map, they've repelled the Russians from Kalinina. I believe the Ukrainians call it Kalinka, but in Russian it's Kalinina, or in Ukrainian it's Kalinovka or Kalinivka. In any case, this was an area that the Russians kind of like moved right in with one assault vehicle. One FPV drone went off and they stationed their men, but it looks like they have been driven out. And but on the other hand, the Russians have expanded their control in the micro district, as you can see, that red outline. The micro district itself now is more than half of it is controlled by the Russians. So progress is slow there. This is a very important, crucial city. The Ukrainians do not want to let go of this because it's about the same height as Chasiv Yar proper. This is a district of Chasiv Yar, of course. And yeah, they know it would be very, very bad if they lost it. So next slide is not too far away from this area. It's north of Bakhmut, which is just north of Soledar. So you could look at this as the Soledar, Seversk, Lysychansk area. And you can see that the Russians have gained some pretty interesting amounts of territory. They gained two big areas around Rozdilivka, and they have a toehold in Rozdelivka. Of course, they took over Belagorovka. This is remember a town that went back and forth several times in 2022 after the Russians withdrew because of because they failed to hold on to Kharkov. And then they tried several times to get it. The Ukrainians would lose it, but then a few days later or a week later, they would retake it. But mostly, it's been under Ukrainian control. So that area has been taken. You can go to the next slide, which is a blow up of it. And importantly, the big waste heap, or it might be chalk or something. I know it's all white, all the footage I've seen in this area. The Russians have secured it. And basically, once they took that, there's now, as long as they man it, the Ukrainians will have a very difficult time to retake it. From there, we go to the northern front, which is past that forest area that you see in the last slide. Okay. So remember that a few weeks ago, the Russians took Berestove. Very heavy fighting to get in the, what is it, the Maevka. I think it's the Stepove Maevka. Anyhow, it is just south of Berestove. So you can see that the Russians have made some gains here. They took over, I believe it's Andrevka. It's another Andrevka. I know, like, there's several Konstantinovskas, several Andrevkas. But those are the gains that that we're seeing here on the Kupiansk front. The next one is a blow up of it. Okay. So again, as I said, very steady gains. These are all gains, like, literally in the last 48 hours. And now we come to the Kharkov offensive. So this is basically the territory that the Russians have kind of held onto since the early May. So it's been almost a month and a half now. Now, it's very interesting. We'll begin with Volchansk, which is the next slide. And you can see that the Ukrainians have made definitely some headway. So this was an area that had all kinds of people debating about what the real red lines were and what was going on, right? Now, the Russians, of course, also, part of this is a bait, right? Because the Russians have not increased their manpower. The Ukrainians are fighting very furiously. They've destroyed at least 4 or 5 trench digging machines, both inside Russia proper and in this area. The Russians, of course, have been fab bombing this area and toss bombing. But the Ukrainians in the last 2 days have fought back with, as I said earlier in the show, with their own U.S. supplied glide bombs, right? And it is very serious stuff. The fighting in here is very intense. But here's what we can say now has happened, okay? So around May 20th, the Ukrainians reported that let me see if I can, okay. So in this area where you see a lot of green outlines, okay, the bottommost part is an area where there is an industrial plant, okay, and as I'm talking, I'm gonna see if I can find you a better image of it, Konstantin. Yeah, you know what? This one so this is the most recent one that I'm adding. The one in the orange and the yellow. Let's just go to that. So basically what happened was the Russians used a special ops team like Spetsnaz, their paratrooper teams, right? Their best trained teams. And just like the Gostomel airport, like, they went way, way deep behind enemy lines, and they took over this area. So they did the same thing here, and they took over an industrial area on the north, just on the southernmost area of the northern part of Volchansk. That was May 20th, and it was Dima of Military Summary who explained this about 2 days ago. Now, on June, and they held on to this area. However, all supplies were given to them using drones, sometimes very large drones that can carry very heavy things. And I don't know what the original amount, maybe 50 guys. On, I believe, August the 2nd, they attempted to bolster their numbers with 5. According to the Ukrainians, 4 of the Russians were killed, 1 made it in. Then on June 6th, 15 fighters made it without getting killed and went into this plant. And then I believe on the 12th or no, 13th or 14th of June, so that's Thursday, Friday last week, an MPV, like a MPB or an infantry fighting vehicle with men on it, I'm going to assume it's no less than 7 or 8. That too went in, again, with no losses. So the Ukrainians have been saying, look, the Russians are surrounded in the industrial zone of Volchansk. The Russians are saying, no, we've got the northern citadel surrounded. And like when you see Military Summary's map, all those red drops, that is the area that he's talking about. Okay. So the Russians, now they lost men trying to feed into this area, as I said earlier. But you know, a lot of the attacks, like in Krasnogorovka, like the Russians went way past, way deep. They secured a stronghold. They did this in Staromayorsk, Urozhanya area, okay, and it worked for them. What I tend to think has happened here is, yes, the Russians got into this area, and a lot of mappers got it wrong. They think because they went into this micro district area, which is the red and the white that you see near the bottom of the frame, that's the industrial area that I'm talking about. There was an assumption that all that yellow above it wasn't there. I think even Syriac maps got it wrong, and then they redid everything. So because there was this assumption that if they went that deep, surely they didn't go that deep without clearing the way. Well, the fact of the matter was that in early mid-May, the Ukrainians did not have a lot of men in the Kharkov direction, and that is why they were able to bypass so many. Some of these guys that they bypassed were policemen with machine guns, essentially. So now those policemen have actually set up machine gun nests, which forced the Russians to use their drones to supply them with, like, you know, food, cigarettes, water, what have you. So very interesting what's happening there, but the Ukrainians have bolstered their numbers here despite the fab bombs, despite the heavy losses. And now we, you know, at the end of the week of last week, we heard that the 82nd and the 42nd had huge losses. The 3rd Battalion of the 42nd, this is according to Ukrainian sources, lost nearly all their men. This is like 450 men, like dead or wounded, or like it's so treated that the relatives of these people are asking the government on Telegram where are their sons and husbands and so on. But the Ukrainians, despite the losses, have flooded this area with more men. The Russians are still outnumbered 3-1 here. They're still not, despite the fact that they're trying to dig in deeper, they are not increasing the number of men. Like, if the Russians want this, they have to increase the number of men. But the Russians are not committed. And I never thought they were, but I thought maybe they would be committed to keep the gains that they've made, but who knows? When I saw these maps, I didn't think the Ukrainians were going to bust out of that pocket that they were like basically both the Russians and the Ukrainians had areas that they had men kind of surrounded, right? In any case, today the news is that the Russians have part of the industrial zone that the Russians control. Part of it has been retaken by the Ukrainians, and the Ukrainians in the northern part have made some headway. So we shall see what will happen to Volchansk. The Russians may abandon it, or the Russians may go back. Remember that the Russians made headway into Krasnogorovka with many attempts, many of them only semi-successful with large losses. Then they got kicked out, and then in late April, and then they went back, and now they control, you know, well over 60% of it. So we wait to see what what they're going to do with Volchansk. In any case, the kind of headway that, because remember there was an idea that the Ukrainians would try to mount an attack on Belgorod, and that would coincide with one of the events that are going on. And there are many events going on with with America and the so-called West, right? So they had the meeting in Italy. They had the so-called peace summit, the G7 in Italy, and they're going to go to Washington in a week or two. And of course, there's also the is that the NATO, Constantine?
NATO is always in July, so that's coming
It's
up
always in July, so it's
within
something
like the
else.
next few weeks.
So I
But
think
the summit in Washington, because I know Italy was G7, which was a clown show in and of itself. Just what do you expect? I mean, especially Macron. Trust me, we'll get into that. But
yeah,
the one I don't think it's G20 in Washington, but it's
no, I don't even know if they. I don't even think they do G20s, but there's something
yeah,
happening
that's
in Washington. I guess what I'm trying to say is I think the Russians did not want Ukraine to have any kind of press victory. Like, or you could look at it this way. When you look at all the towns that they've taken in the last 4 weeks since their Kharkov offensive, even though it was little, it was limited. As I said, even when it first appeared, I said they're doing this to try to get all the Ukrainians to rush men into this area so it'll free up area in Donetsk. And the Russians have made gains on that. Novoalexandrovka, Umansk, Natalyove, Gregorovka, like many towns. They were pushed out of Chasiv Yar in the micro district. Now they control more than half of the micro district. So, Razdolivka, there's so many, Belagorovka, there's so many, Berestove, there's many towns that they did not have or may not have been able to have unless the Ukrainians have to go in there because they're woefully short of armor, and so they have to make up with it with men. And this is why there are also large losses. But to their credit, they are very determined. And they're willing to sacrifice.
well, I think if this past week and a half in particular shows anything, especially with Kharkov, if there was any question about it, it shows that Russia does have the strategic initiative in this war now. That Ukraine is the reactive player in this
Yes,
game. That it is
yes,
the one who has to react to Russian moves. Whereas there was a while there, especially say September 2022 to early 2023, up until the so-called summer counteroffensive until 2023. While there were few successes, Ukraine overall did have the initiative. It decided where the battles took place. It decided what fronts they were going to meet on. It had the ability to send these groups, these Russian Freedom Legions, to strike into places like Belgorod, launch strikes on places like Bryansk, all the border raids that took place last year. But since the summer counteroffensive, since the exhaustion of Ukrainian manpower and resources, it has become Russia's board again. They control where the battles take place. They decide on which fronts the war will be fought. And that's not saying that there's just a steamroll at this point that they're unstoppable. The Ukrainians still do have a responsive power. As you said, they have to make up with men because of their lack of armor, because of their lack of support, which is very costly, but it still is not to downplay the loss of human life here. It still does create
Right.
the necessary stopgap. And I suppose that goes back to the old tongue in cheek comment that's been going on since the beginning of this war. The AFU is such a fierce fighting force because it's full of Russians. But
Yeah, I mean, there was that image, I'll see if I can find it. Oh my God, it's so sad. Um, the image of the Azov guys um on one of their talk shows, like, these guys are like they're
oh,
they're
is
having
this
their
the
interviews.
morbidly obese Azov guy?
No, no, oh no, that's, I mean,
Yeah,
yeah,
that.
that's just ridiculous, but um no, it was the picture of, like, we've been saying this since 2022, that they get these poor guys, um who, yes, here it is, I'm going to send it to you. It's just so sad. Like, just look at the guys that they're conscripting, the 43 plus guys, 43-year-old plus guys that you read about on the New York Times, Politico, CNN, Times of London, Washington Post. So, the Azov guys are like celebs. There they are on one of the talk shows. And that the ones at the bottom, that's the meat. That's who makes up the meat grinder. That isn't to say Azov guys don't die. They do, especially if they underestimate, let's say, the strength of a particular area on the front line, and the Ukraine and the Russians hit them really hard. This was the case in Avdiivka.
But to continue on your point here,
Yeah.
these are the men who get put in those stopgap positions on the front line. The ones who are supposed
Yes.
to be the
Yeah.
meat
Absolutely.
shield to stop the Russians. And you look at the demographics, they're older men. They're in their 30s. A lot of them are pushing 40. Some of them are even in their 40s. I remember it might have been Ben Hodges. It was one of these people who said, "Well, the advantage of older soldiers is that they can't retreat as easily, so they'll hold the line." Just one of these, one of these pigs
Yeah.
came out and said that. Like I said, I think it was either Ben Hodges or Ben Wallace, but they all sort of blend together after a certain point. But these are the men from places like Kherson, from Zaporozhye, from Kharkov, from these central and eastern oblasts in Ukraine, who you look at the Azov guys up top. So many things you could say about them. That I'm going to just out of the
Yeah.
sake of saving
Yeah.
time
Yeah.
here,
Yeah.
gloss over. I've said them all before. We've said them all
Yeah. I
before.
know. And,
Um,
and we've been saying it since 2022. Like,
since before 2022,
yeah.
but yeah, these people, there's not enough words for them. But these are the people who have that fluid ethnic identity. The people who uh, viewed by the Azov guys as no better than the Russians, as no better than the orcs, who their sole purpose for the Ukrainian project is to be a meat shield, and they've outright said that. They have nothing but contempt for these men. And you also, returning to the point about age, the average Ukrainian frontline soldier being 43 years old is the figure that's getting tossed around now. Uh, Ukraine does lack young men. That it is in a demographic crisis, especially between emigration and just low birth rates, where those all meet, and it creates the crisis here. But as people have pointed out, and I have pointed out before, but I just like to reiterate this. I don't know if anyone. This is the first episode of the War Report anyone's listening to. First of all, welcome. Secondly, to reiterate this point, something you need to understand about Ukraine is pretty much anyone 27 to 30 and under are invaluable for the Ukrainian state because these are the people, even if they weren't born after the Maidan, These were the people who had their most formative years of their life. Uh, their young adulthood, their early teens, being
Yeah,
brought up in this system of a new Ukrainian identity, if you will, of
yeah,
where one of the primary traits of that is just this eternal ethnic animus against Russians. The Russians have nothing to do with us. They're Asiatic orcs. We are the real Rus, but also we're going to sacrifice everything that makes us the Rus in order to conform to the West. Once again,
like the gay pride parade.
wrap your head around that one. Valhalla speaks Ukrainian, as we've all been told, but these aren't the men you can send into the front lines, because if you do, if you are able to mobilize this manpower, and I know that they have lowered the conscription age to 25, you're throwing away the fertile ground in which you've planted what could be described as your new ethnogenesis. Because
Yeah.
these young men die, all the work you've done over the past 10 years trying to create uh, what you claim is Ukrainian identity, a new Ukrainian identity, it's gone. It's down the drain. And not to mention, you expose these men to the conditions that, say, their um, older male relatives are, whether they be fathers, uncles, whatever. That is not going to endear them to this fight. These are the people who are either, once again, safe in Kiev, or in exile in the West, living in Germany, living in the UK, living elsewhere, who are the most vocal advocates of this war, of course.
Hmm.
And that always happens. The people who don't fight in the wars, with exceptions, I will say, are usually the most rabid hawks about said wars. But the combination of you don't want these men to get slaughtered because your entire national project, assuming you can get them to come home, relies on that. So that's a that's another situation they're going to have to continue with, actually incentivizing these men to return home after this war ends in their favor, which they still are at least under the delusion, or at least publicly have to be under the delusion, is going to be the case. And
Take a
also,
look at how many young men there are right now in Germany watching, attending the Ukraine Romania.
yeah, that's yes, that the Romanians have been going wild. I've seen some of
I
that. That's
mean,
been, but I
if,
digress.
I'm sorry to interrupt, but I remember back in late 2022, or mid, like second half, somewhere in the second half of 2022, but not winter. I remember my brother saying, "What are you talking about? Ukraine is like less than 25 million people now." And I thought, like, I mean, yeah, it's low, but he goes, it's probably more like 22 million. I couldn't believe it. Then I saw an episode, with the judge and Colonel McGregor, and he said it like something like 22, 23 million people. That's it. It's not 31 or 39 million people anymore. They're all gone. They've fled, right? And it wasn't until like the end of 2023, the beginning of 2024, that finally I saw Western sources claim less than 25 million. So they were right. They were
And
right.
I'm just going to bring up this graph again. I like to keep this one on hand. This is a February report from Ukrainska Pravda given us to the Twitter account called From Kherson that details the status of military aged men in Ukraine. So the plurality of them live in Russian controlled territory, whether that be somewhere in the Donbass, whether that be somewhere in Kherson, Zaporozhye, etc. The next 25% are employed in fields in which they're not going to draw conscripts from, whether that's something vitally to do with war, or whether there's some graft and corruption going on, as we know there are. Next large group, to read this off once again, 13% are invalids unfit for duty. And once again, you have to question what standard that's held to, how many of these men know somebody or have paid somebody off in order to get some sort of medical exemption for this. 11% are actually in the armed forces of Ukraine, the AFU. Another 11% are outside of the country, and 5% are business owners, which are also exempt. Which, as of once again, these figures are a few months out of date, but I would
Yeah.
love to get more up to date figures if anyone has them on hand. Which leaves about 9% or 950,000 men who can be drawn into military service, which are the people they've been throwing into vans all across the country of Ukraine, as the
The
videos
the
we've.
BBC did a video today, on press gangs in Ukraine. They literally showed videos of these guys being snatched off the street. The New York Times had a story yesterday about low manpower, low morale, press gangs. It's very weird considering like what's happening with the peace summit, the G7 meeting. We're going to take the 50 billion, or I mean the interest, anyways. Um, you know, and then you have like major Western publications, media sources that are, if nothing, contradicting that message.
Oh, absolutely. And you see more. I'm convinced that there has to be some sort of A/B testing going on
Mm.
from the media, from the regime, with how night and day their own coverage on Ukraine is. Because one day you pull up the New York Times and you see articles talking about how hopeless the Ukrainian war effort is. The next day you pull it up, you're seeing Western leaders talking about escalation, talking about moving into Ukraine, expeditionary forces, advisors, etc., all the nonsense that they have been uh, pushing out. The most recent notable one was the New York Times wrote an article covering the tentative peace agreement reached at the beginning of this war in 2022. That was
Yes, they
complete.
published the whole thing. Before it was a German publication that published some of it.
Yeah, because I
But
know that originally it was around April of last year, a year after it happened. Lukashenko came out and
yeah,
dropped it all because he was, of course, with the Minsk agreements previously, he was instrumental in being the brokering power in this peace. Now, this all
yeah.
took place in Turkey, but Belarus has this past decade, ever since the Maidan, has been a pivotal country in brokering some sort of peace between Russia and Ukraine. So Lukashenko comes out last year, drops that. Then one of the German publications picked it up, and I don't think it was Spiegel. It was one of the other ones.
Yeah.
And then now, within the past week, the New York Times picks it up and throws it out there, talking about how far off Ukrainian peace seems and how it was once so close and how we've lost our opportunity. Now, like I said, there's a lot of things you can, a lot of ways you can interpret this, and I'm sure that's on purpose that they don't want. They want to generate the controversy. They want to generate the quote unquote debate. Not that, like I said, I mean, the media, it's powerful. It's not all powerful. But sometimes they will just throw a wrench in it just to affect public discourse, especially when there are major decisions to be made. And it is strange because the Ukraine issue, in terms of the presidential campaign, has fallen off the radar, especially in the light of Trump's legal woes. That has become really the front and center issue of the campaign, as well as other domestic issues that have come up recently, such as some debates about immigration, income tax, which, like I said, if we have time, I'll get into some of the just more minutia of internal U.S. politics towards the end of the show. But like I said, we'll judge that based on how our time goes to the rest of the topics we have to cover. But once again, Ukraine is one of those things that is always in the public consciousness, but it's not front and center. It's not been front and center for quite some time. And I would say this year, in terms of mainstream media Ukraine coverage, aside from Macron's saber rattling, it's taken a back seat. Like I said, I don't want to pretend like it's been memory hold or anything, but it has taken a back seat, especially in light of Israel, in light of domestic issues. It is not able to draw the sort of attention that it did, say, even year ago. So I'm still trying to work out why exactly the full details on this peace agreement were published, and it was as
Hmm.
truthful as a New York Times article can be, where they didn't say the Ukrainians were all in for peace, but the Russians reneged last minute. I mean, of course, they had a lot of the just bog standard propaganda that is practically required to get a piece like that published. But it was saying that yes, the Russians said they had only gone towards Kiev as a negotiation tactic. That Russian and Ukrainian negotiators were meeting. Oh, another instance of this coming out was in January this year. Arestovich said that in his interview with Unheard,
Hmm.
He went over the details of that, and so
Yes, that's right. That's right. I mean, if anything, like let's say both sides tell lies, but if you had to choose which side is being more truthful, it's Putin and Russia. People laughed and scoffed at this. They said it was cope. Ever since the Russians first said it back in 2022, now it's obvious. Even the New York Times has to accept it. That like it was a poor tactic. It was bad strategy. To pressure the Ukrainians. But if I guess if you were Putin and it's March and the Istanbul agreements are going very well, and all you can think about is, gee, how can I soften the blow to the Russians and the rest of the people in Ukraine who want to join Russia? That this territory that we conquered. Well, really, it's except for the Donetsk republics, Zaporozhye, Kherson, we're going to move out. But it seemed he was very eager. Like in many ways, like if it wasn't just a trick all, you know, from the beginning, then what you're looking at is Zelensky's thought like, yeah, I'm gonna go along with this. This is pretty good. And of course, everybody knows about Boris Johnson. Now, a lot of people will disagree and say, no, the whole thing was a ruse. Just like Minsk 1 and 2. Well, the truth of the matter is they say it was a ruse, but in terms of how they didn't want to put sanctions on Russia, in terms of how they dragged their feet until the MH117 went down, like, no, that's not really entirely true. They're just saying that in 2022, 2023, and 2024 to comply with the consensus.
and
But
also look at
anybody who watched that war, like I did from 2014 and onwards, that's not the case.
absolutely, and look at
The,
Zelensky's own election campaign
yeah.
in 2019, when
Yes.
his main issue was a diplomatic resolution of this conflict, deciding on the status of Crimea later, and actually holding referenda in the Donbass republics to see
Mhm.
what the fate of them should be, whether it's increased federalization in Ukraine. And he won the same demographic that Yanukovych won, with eastern and southern, predominantly Russian-speaking populations in Ukraine. And this is what he ended up delivering. And I'm not saying Zelensky is completely blameless, far from, but this man doesn't know what he's doing. He's not exactly an independent actor here, despite his previous occupation. But yes, going back to the Istanbul Accords, going back to 2022 and the negotiations that took place, it did seem like there was a real breakthrough that Putin was going to use this invasion or threat of invasion or threat of continued war in order to enforce the pre 2013 status quo in Ukraine. Now, how well would that have worked in the long term? I don't know. But it did seem like that was the genuine goal, that this wasn't just some throwaway accord, that they had made progress, that signatures were given by both sides, and that you did have a withdrawal of Russian forces in a great number, and then all of a sudden a certain atrocity within a Kiev suburb took place. I'm not sure whether we're allowed to mention that on YouTube still. I know they were very touchy about that when it first happened,
Hmm.
which suddenly justified Boris Johnson going over there and calling the whole peace agreement
Right.
off, and leading us to the situation where we are today. And now you have the New York Times.
And interestingly, only the UK was allowed to investigate Bucha.
I did not know.
Yeah, so the UN has no opinion on it, right?
That's
I mean, the UN is still waiting for toxology reports from Navalny from 2020. The whole they put poison in my underwear nonsense, right?
same with a lot of the cases in Syria. A lot of the evidence there is still inconclusive regarding the so-called chemical attacks in 2017
Hmm.
and 2018. Um, and also on that note, did they ever come to any definitive conclusion about the Skripal case? Remember that from 2018?
Oh yeah, I mean when they claim the amount of poison that they put everywhere and that nobody died, like it's preposterous. But there was something that happened. I'm sorry. I will shut up after this.
No, no, please
I
go
don't
on.
mean, but we did talk about bringing this up anyhow. So you mentioned Skripal. So remember back in 2014, there was some kind of ammo depot in Czech Republic that like it had World War II munitions, and they blew up. I think they killed a guard, right? And these two Russians were blamed for it. Later, those Russians were accused of trying to kill Skripal. Those two guys. They become a meme now. They're sitting together at a table, and they said, "Well, we came to England to admire Gothic architecture." That was one of the interviews. Okay, so there has been another munitions that has blown up, and this is my segue. Remember we spoke about this last week, just a small number of days ago, about how there have been these, you know, like I'm not necessarily saying it's the Russians, but was there not some kind of a munitions plant like in the US on I want to say on the East Coast, either close to like Washington or New York that had a major fire? And then another one weeks later occurred in Germany, right? And people are saying, well, yes, it is a military office, but it's not like one German guy was saying it's not really where they manufacture a lot of stuff. I don't know. But then there were these articles that popped up in May about like the Russians are committing sabotage, expect more of it. Anyways, we kept saying that we were going to bring it up, and and I mean, listen, it's my fault. I kept forgetting like three
No, no,
shows
I'm
in a
glad.
row.
I'm glad you got to it now. But that is interesting. I will say. I will say that much. And I think a lot of that is inconclusive. So I really don't have much more to add
Yeah.
than just the facts of the situation. But given everything else, that is interesting. But I am, once again, to return to this New York Times article, not to fixate on too much because Ryan going to read it on the show. I don't know exactly what the intent of this was. Why publish this now? Is it
Yeah.
because Putin made his? Is it because Putin made his hand waving trollish peace offer, which was, of course, harsher than the peace terms in 2022, and the way I read it, it being, of course, it's not serious. He doesn't expect any sort of agreement regarding this, especially with the ridiculous Swiss peace conference and everything going on with that. But is this his final offer, so to speak, before he just demands capitulation? And because rhetoric coming out of Russia, if you especially look at Medvedev, now I know he is the boisterous one. He's supposed to be the outspoken one, the one who gets up there and saber rattles Medvedev. He he's excelled at that in the past few years, and that he'll say once again a lot of the more outlandish things out there. But I do have to wonder from a serious Russian stance in terms of how they're actually running their country beyond just rhetoric, with them saying they no longer recognize Zelensky as a legitimate leader of Ukraine because of the expiration of his term without the holding of new elections. It does make me wonder, and I know that Putin said, "Oh, if this offer is rejected, I'm only going to demand more territory from Ukraine, etc., etc., etc." Which, once again, a lot of that is rhetoric game. But I do have to wonder how many more "quote unquote" peace offers will there be, and how much further is Russia willing to push this? Because it certainly has cost Russians a great deal of things, whether that be in terms of comfort and lifestyle. Now, I know their economy has recovered and is actually excelling beyond what it was before the war. Also, in terms of manpower, and while it's nowhere near as Ukraine, there has to be, of course, just because of the nature of something like this, some degree of exhaustion that does set in with the population. Now, I think that general support for the continuation of military operations in Ukraine probably does remain pretty high. Probably does remain in the high 70s at least in terms of public opinion. But it does make you wonder how much further is Russia going to push this? How much further they have the capability to push this? And how much is the West going to tolerate before it escalates as well? Because there has been plenty of talk about that, with
Hmm.
the provision of aircraft, with the provision of long range missiles, with the speculation of some sort of quote unquote peace deployment to Ukraine that has been going on since the beginning of this year. It Once again, it makes you wonder how much
Yeah.
further is this going to be allowed to be pushed? What is I know everyone loves to talk about Putin's red lines, but what are the West's red lines? I know
Hmm.
that when there were advances on the southern front in 2023, late 2022, 2023, towards Nikolaev, you had U.S. military drills in Romania, that you had the speculation of a quote unquote dirty bomb being used by the Russians. And that did seem to cease operations there. Now, I'm sure there were a number of other factors at play, but those two those two events did coincide. So when it comes to how much further Russia is willing to push, I do think it's an interesting question. And as we get more into European politics, some of the results out of the EU Parliament, not that it means much, but it is a good barometer showing where public opinion is in Europe is. And also, I think most notably, the biggest piece of news to come out of Europe in the past several months is the failure to reach consensus on the most recent sanctions package.
Hmm. That's interesting. But you mentioned earlier about, is this some kind of A/B testing? I think that was very insightful. And I would say, now that I've been listening to you and had some time to think, every single time there's a Western media campaign that is either about low manpower, low morale, depleted munitions, depleted armor, high losses of the Ukrainians, um, it's always been to give them more money, more munitions. Also, remember, just as a side note, the Americans were not specific at all what the Ukrainians were going to get in terms of how many air defense missiles exactly. That wasn't the case in late 2022 for everything that would go online in early 2023, right? They spelled it out. There's only been a small spelling out here. Uh, yes, they've ordered more HIMARS, 100 of them, but those will take years to manufacture. We don't know exactly how many missiles. And um, one of the reasons they're probably not mentioning it is they don't have a lot. And that's why, like, for instance, the F-16s and all the nonsense about the F-16s will get armed in Romania and Poland. They'll fly into Ukraine or Russia, hit targets, and then fly back. No, they'll fly from Romania or Poland into Ukraine, get armed by the Ukrainians, fly on their mission, then fly back outside of Ukraine after they've spent their it's
It's the most
ludicrous.
legalistic hair splitting thing I think I've ever seen, honestly.
Yes.
And I've seen a lot of things in that regard. But it has to be up there. It has to be
Yeah.
on top of that. But
So
I do have to wonder with the question of the F-16s, if the collective West is just going to dump every F-16 in existence into Ukraine, how are they going to continue to bribe Turkey to stay on the West's good side?
yeah, yeah. Um yeah, I don't know. Um so this A/B testing, I think a lot of it is it this is might have to do with the escalation, right? They're basically telling you uh Ukraine might snap. Ukraine might not have months and months or a few years left. They might only have a few months left. And what do you want to do? Like, do you want to let Russia win? I mean, they were adamant. Remember that last year, in many ways, uh, the Zaporozhye counteroffensive by Ukraine went very poorly. And even though it started on June the 4th, but by June 19th, I believe there was a NATO summit, or there was some kind of it was some kind of a summit, and I think it was taking place in Lithuania. And it's around that time that people were, in the West, even some Western leaders, even Biden made this faux pas. they said something like, instead of as long as it takes, as much as we can. So there was some kind of and now they've really gone the other way. I mean, they are saying for as long as it takes, Russia must not win under any cause, under any circumstances. Um,
I mean, also look at the domestic projection with this. You have the UK
yeah.
pushing for national service, and now the US has gone as far as to they passed the act that will close any gaps in any selective service registration, but also in this upcoming fiscal year have expanded that mandatory registration to women as well. So, I
Now,
guess
is there a chance that the Senate will strike this down? What do you think?
um I mean, honestly, given the composure of the Senate and given how much of a uniparty issue this is, unless there's some sort of great popular outcry, I don't know, maybe Trump will come out and say something and wield his level of influence over Senate Republicans, which I know the Senate's Democrat, but like I said, getting into the intricacy of the Senate, 60 votes, whatever. I think it probably can get passed. I wouldn't be shocked if it didn't, but I'm expecting it to. I'll just put it that way. It could go either way, but I more or less expect it to. You might get, I don't know, like maybe a Rand Paul filibuster, which I mean those are entertaining. Don't get me wrong, but uh, those have, let's just say, a very varied success rate. In just to put it that way.
Right.
But I do I do have a feeling that this is actually going to pass, especially if they want to give off the image of domestic military projection, the fact that they can begin a conscription campaign. Now, I think that would be, frankly, culturally and administratively speaking, the death knell of the United States if they tried something like that. And I don't mean that dramatically. I don't think this country's social fabric could withstand another
Yeah.
conscription crisis, especially now, especially with how politically polarized everything is. I mean, you thought the 60 was bad, and I mean, you actually look at the number, how relatively low the number of drafted men into Vietnam was compared to just regular enlisted men. It was only like 1/3 of them were. I mean, that's still a lot, but compared to the kind of numbers they would want to muster if they were to get involved in another land war in continental Europe against another peer or near peer power, depending on how you want to measure this, that the amount of manpower and resource that would require would be monumental compared to what the United States is able to put forward right now. And I think one thing a lot of people forget about U.S. intervention in both Europe and the Middle East is that since the 90s, since the end of the Cold War, we progressively deconstructed the military infrastructure we had in Europe. The amount of troops we have in Germany, even though we have had troop surges into some parts of Europe, especially in Poland and the Baltic states, the amount of troops that we have in NATO countries is a fraction of what it was even in the 1980s, even at the tail end of the Cold War.
Yeah.
A lot of that military infrastructure simply does not exist anymore. It was either scrapped and sold off, given to the subsidiary countries, which haven't maintained it as well as, say, the U.S. in the 1980s would have. It has been shifted to some parts of the Middle East, and once again, you even see the deconstruction of that military infrastructure in the Middle East. Maybe some parts of East Asia, or it's moved domestically, or it's moved into some irrelevant theater that serves no purpose. But the U.S. military's force projection since the 1990s has only been on a consistent decline.
Hmm.
Whereas, look, the Russians may have had a hard time getting started in this war. They may have suffered from demilitarization, selling off military assets since the 90s onward, just because of the dire economic situation of Russia. But with this war, this is a country that has remilitarized. This is a country that has become a modern military that can fight a modern industrial war. Of course, with its pitfalls, every country is going to have its pitfalls. But you cannot say the same about the principal power of the West, which is the United States, when it has spent decades dismantling this military infrastructure. Now, I know that a lot of the neocons, especially when Obama was in office, really got on their high horse about him defunding the military, which, I mean, military spending actually went up under Obama, but that's aside the point. But
Yeah.
you do look at the maintenance and how the money is spent in the U.S. military beyond just these boondoggles, beyond just these wasteful bureaucratic projects, but in terms of actually having the money to produce a capable military force able to accomplish whatever mission you put in front of it, that has declined. That's been in a consistent decline for a number of decades now. And like I said, you can talk about the inefficiency within the Russian system, but especially since the outbreak of this war, this has been a military that has been reoriented to actually fight a war. China is an untested power here when it comes to that. We don't know how they would perform in a war, how their military industrial complex functions, but we look at the U.S. First off, the kind of wars it's been fighting, these irregular conflicts in the Middle East. Secondly, like I said, the just complete stripping and dismantling of our military power because we've relied so much on soft power. I don't know how they expect to bring back the behemoth that was, say, even the U.S. military that fought the Gulf War. And I know the Gulf War was an extremely lopsided affair, but it was an efficient affair. Whether you thought it was a good thing, whether you thought it was a bad thing, they did it very efficiently. It was a very quick affair, and it showed an organized professional military that was capable of waging a large scale war effort. And that simply doesn't exist anymore. That doesn't exist in any parts of Europe. The closest thing I would say you have is Turkey or Poland, neither of which, I mean, yeah, they could pack a punch in their own right, but neither of which can really carry the entirety of NATO on their backs. And in terms of Europe's industrial capacity, even if you, okay, maybe you could extend that to the French, but also you look at France's military campaigns in the past 3 decades, it has been these skirmishes in Africa. It has been shoring up these trade interests and these remnants of their colonial interests in Africa and maybe on some
And
other.
most of the time playing a supporting role
Oh yeah,
for America,
absolutely.
like the British,
Yeah, the
basically.
British are the premier of that. But when it comes to actual conventional war-ready powers in NATO, it's Poland and Turkey, which, like I said, they can pack a punch in their own right, but they're not going to carry the entirety of NATO on their back. And then you have just the situation with deindustrialization in Europe. You're not going to get a French military-industrial complex or a German military-industrial complex back up and running. Not that the U.S. would want that in the first place. They would view it as too much of a threat to their own power, too much of a threat to their own bottom line, even if the situation were to demand it, like the more outlandish proposal they're making right now. Well, just given the economic and industrial crisis in Europe, I don't think that the major powers of Europe, France, Germany, and the UK, have the ability to even up military production and to the level that they could have, say, even a decade ago.
Hmm. Yeah, I wonder if, I mean, anything can happen. Anything can happen. But I wonder if someone in the West is strategizing a little differently. Like, for instance, we need to keep the war going until Putin is out of office, or until Putin is out of office, and we cause more unrest within. Because ultimately, this war really, there's two big reasons why this war is happening. And one of them is to destabilize and overthrow Russia in order to contain and control China again, which they have essentially lost control of. Now, just yesterday, there was a hostage taking that happened inside a Russian prison in Rostov on Don. Uh, the culprits who did this were all of them were Muslim. In fact, the Russians got an imam to try to talk them down, which did not work. The Russians went in with some kind of special forces. Remarkably, no guards that were taken hostage died, and all six were eliminated. Now, the guys over at Russians with Attitude, like, I mean, okay, like it's in many ways Russia's not a Western country. Okay, they showed like three bodies. The guys are handcuffed and they're dead. It's like what is going? You know what I mean? Like they didn't handcuff them after they shot them dead. And then the Russian government said that they're not going to reveal the bodies. It's really crazy. Like, I mean, I don't know what that's about, but what if there's a different kind of strategy that they're not going to escalate. They're going to find a way to keep the war going until they have that time where because that's the next thing on the horizon, right? Like freeze the war, start the war again when Putin is about to leave office, because he's not going to get reelected again. He's going to be too old. Like he gained 6 years, but the West can be patient. I don't know. I'm just throwing that out there. Um, as as a way to finally piece this puzzle together. Like I just wonder about that because you know like I mean we talk about this almost every show. If they're really interested about defeating Russia, right? They're not going to defeat Russia with the conventional war. One of the reasons why the Russians are not refortifying Kharkov, I believe, because they have something like in excess of, they have an extra 350,000 troops. And I was saying, you and I were both saying this back in 2022, that I think the Russians are always afraid of NATO entering Ukraine. I think they've war gamed it in such a way that they must keep, 250 to 350 to maybe even 400,000 troops ready to deal with NATO entrance into the war.
Absolutely, and also especially with their positioning in Belarus, it allows for a quick relief of Kaliningrad if that were ever to be the case. Because if there were to be an outright brazen direct NATO intervention, the isolation of Kaliningrad, which is a massive Russian military stronghold,
Yeah.
would be one of the first priorities that they do. They would send Poland and the Baltic states to put it lay it to siege, and Belarus would also be another avenue of entrance.
Yeah,
So,
it would be an embargo. It would be an embargo. Maybe they're looking, I mean, but they would need a casus belli for that, right?
oh, absolutely, that they can't just do that unprovoked. But,
Yeah,
and
speaking of Belarus and speaking of Lukashenko.
oh yes, please go on. I know exactly what you're going to say, and I
Oh,
can.
you do you?
Yeah, go
Well,
on, please.
our boy Luka had some very interesting things to say when he was addressing members of parliament. There's an investigation into corruption taking place in Belarus. And we would remind our listeners that Belarus has a very, very small Jewish population. But according to Luca, uh, of the 33 uh, individuals under investigation, 15 of them that will be charged with corruption are Jews. And Lukashenko was wondering, how can such a small minority be so overrepresented? He's not anti-Semitic. He's just puzzled by
When you notice a pattern, you notice a pattern. What else can you say?
it. God love him. He's too much. My other, I don't even know if it's real, but the other one. What do you say? I'd rather be a dictator than gay.
Yeah, he said that to. It was 2006. I can't remember the German foreign minister at the time. He said that to the German foreign minister, who was an open gay man. When when questioned about that,
remember that Twitter meme? You will never be this based. Yeah, you will never be this based.
well, I'm sure you remember in 2020 that out of the few countries that have suffered a color revolution, he had a rifle in hand, ready to go down with the ship.
He did with his son.
Yeah,
And part of that was he refused to go along with the WHO. Yeah. So they said, well, we're gonna, all those loans and investments, we're gonna. He said, all right, fine. Yeah, he's quite something. He's great.
and mind you, he actually he courted the West for a number of years, pretty much up
Yeah.
until that 2020 color revolution, when they showed that any deal of cooperation required complete subservience to the West, and he cut them off. And like I said, remember, mind you, this is the country that negotiated two Minsk agreements, that
Yeah.
wanted to maintain the status quo in Ukraine because he was so interested in playing both sides of the West and Russia. And
Ultimately, he is the puppet master.
the, the axis on which Europe tilts is Alexander Lukashenko. Few will actually tell you that. The power behind the power,
Yeah,
the
it's him.
snubbed true president of Russia, the man who Putin usurped, if you listen to some conspiracy theories.
Yeah, that's right. That's right.
who who knows how he would have fared in the same position? What Russia would look like today? Um, but we might have kielbasa and potatoes every night, but
Yeah, it would be very based.
it would be. I'm sure you remember his delegation in Moscow. When he showed up with just a traditional Belarusian fare and smoothed out the relations in one night. That
I
was
know.
yes, but very much a larger than life figure. It's very hard to hate him despite many of the flaws you could bring up.
Hmm.
It
Hmm.
just like I said, the larger than life man. You can't help but love him. But
Yeah, yeah,
uh,
I agree.
d-
And
d-
he's younger than Putin.
yeah,
Just
yeah,
saying.
that is an interesting point you bring up there. And yeah, they've been very close for the past few years here. But actually, to backtrack a bit, because
Hmm.
but once again, thank you for bringing that important Belarusian news to light. When it comes to the hybrid war against Russia, I guess we can call it, because I do completely agree that Ukraine is just the start of this, and that if they couldn't secure a battlefield victory in Ukraine, it's just going to be used as one of many vectors in order to chip away at Russia, which has been the plan since the 90s. Once again, you can look at George Soros. You can look at all of this. This has been plain as day.
Yeah,
They've
yeah, yeah.
what they've done with their recent what the U.S. has done with its recent executive order on sanctions is forced Russia and China even closer together
Yes,
with
they have.
with the sanctions that they have implemented on Chinese banks, which they have implemented. Any Chinese financial institution dealing with the Russian Federation is liable to sanctions. And
Yeah, literally any bank. If they think that they're working with the Russian government, America will sanction them. I mean, Blinken threatened he would do this when he visited. Well, let them go ahead because Putin finally made a statement that they will soon introduce a kind of a world reserve currency. I don't imagine it will be just like the American, but Chinese. I do, however, uh, think it will be significant. Like everybody's talking about this. Saudi Arabia cuts 50-year deal with America. Like I'm not sure how much of a deal it was. Um, as the guys in the Duran said, it was America was the only game in town in the 70s. You weren't going to do that with a communist country, obviously, right? That was the whole point
with
of
how
exporting
financialized.
communism to Russia. But yeah, so like it's just, I mean, and just for the listeners know, the Chinese Communist Party isn't really communist. China's not really a communist country. It's not really capitalist either. If you want to be more accurate, it's fascist. Okay. So yeah, it is what it is. And so um yeah.
Yeah, yeah.
But
You actually
go
look
ahead.
at the economic reforms of Deng Xiaoping right after Mao died. A lot of his economic reforms resembled a lot of what you saw out of Germany in the 30s. And like I
Yeah.
said, I'm not making any other comparison beyond economic structures. Just I doubt anyone's going to take me out of context here, but just for the sake of utmost clarity, I'm not making any comparison beyond economic structures when I say that statement here. And yeah, you look at that; it is probably the epitome of a mixed model
Yeah.
economy with heavy state intervention, but also enough capital in the market to keep the economy dynamic enough to compete. And I would say that pretty much sums up the way the Chinese system has
Yeah.
functioned since the 80s, and it has done great things for them, as we've seen with the meteoric growth in the Chinese economy as of late. But going back to what you're saying, the Moscow exchange, it's done trading on the euro and the dollar, in that it is opening its own exchange, particularly with the yuan and with other currencies as well, in order to create an alternative to the U.S. dollar. You referenced the Duran, which I think they brought up great points about the U.S. relationship with Saudi Arabia. That
Hmm.
was at the height of the power of the U.S. dollar, and
Yeah, yeah.
it was in the 70s. There were economic woes at the time. Don't get me wrong, but that is what they were going to attach themselves to. The Saudis had the opportunity to enter into an extremely lucrative deal with the premier economy in the world. And as their powers waned, as we've seen in the past decade, more and more cooperation with the Chinese has taken place. since about 2015, 2016, you've seen Chinese money, Chinese advisors coming into places like Saudi Arabia, the United Arab Emirates, these Gulf states, these oil-rich Gulf states, and they've been turning their perspective eastward. Now, that's not to say they've cut off the West entirely. There's still a lot of money to be garnered in playing both sides of this. But the attached to the hip relationship that the Saudis and the Americans once had is over, and that's in no small part thanks to
Joining BRICS.
oh yeah, that's certainly this, but
Yeah.
this war, the sanctions package, the idea of creating a economic bifurcation of the world. You're either with us or against us. Bringing back George Bush rhetoric.
Yeah.
When it comes to these sanctions, when you have love them or hate them, these more business-minded countries like Saudi Arabia, they're going to look at this. They're going to say we can either attach ourselves to this system, or we can side with the more business-oriented bloc in the world, that being BRICS at this point. Now, uh,
Right. Well, I mean, Saudi Arabia wants a lot of investment, and America just, selling weapons isn't really an investment. America's not the only game in town now for weapons, and for sophisticated weapons, to even more so, right? Um, China's not at war. America is at war. Okay, it is at war. It's writing a lot of checks that it's going to have to print a lot of money for, and the Chinese understand that that's going to eventually devalue the dollar. Now, I'm going to tell you something. I cannot disclose particularly on air that there is. I was talking with somebody, but there is money that is currently flooding out of Kazakhstan, and the guy that I was talking to, he basically thinks like, oh, Russia and China are going to go to war with one another eventually. And I said, no, they won't. I said, Russia and China will stay together until America's defeated. What happens after that, I don't know. But I said, do you want to know why they're going to stay together until America is defeated? And he goes, why? I said, because if Russia falls, so does China. So no, they're not. Now, the stuff that's happening in Kazakhstan, like China, like Uzbekistan, like all the other stands right now, is buying tons and tons of gold. They're preparing for something, right? Especially the last 2 years, and especially those countries. So, um, but the guy that I'm talking about he's my age, but he's very much a normie. He's very, very much an Anglo normie, right? And all he's ever seen his whole life is one victory followed by another, and he thinks that's what's going to happen here as well. But the fact of the matter is, all this kookiness ever since, let's say, COVID, the large scale printing of the American dollar, like America has put itself in this position where it will literally have to turn violent in order to keep people using its dollar.
because it's
Uh,
burned up all of its confidence, its reputation.
yeah,
That the only thing it has right now is a threat of force, if not outright use of force, in order to keep this system in place. And look, you can put a lot of blame on Biden, and I do think he's greatly accelerated the process. But this has been the making of several presidents, going back, I would say, to the second Bush administration since Bush Jr.
yeah,
And it's only
yeah.
escalated since. Trump was also part of that, and like I said, I think Biden, especially with his failing faculties and just how pathetic he looks on any given day and how unhinged he also looks on any given day, has also played in that. You listen to some of Trump's rhetoric about the U.S. dollar, talking about how we're going to need to use some real force to get the world back on the dollar. That's a project he's
Ah,
that's a project he's determined to. And like, sure, you might think, oh yeah, as an American, I want the world to use the dollar. That's very economically beneficial. Well, yeah, okay, in a vacuum that makes sense, but I don't think you realize the amount of effort that would take in order to bring back the
the world
hegemony
has
of the
moved
dollar.
past that.
No, yeah,
They've moved
it's
past it. Yeah,
yeah, that era
it's
is
it's
over,
done.
and someone who wants to bring that back, like I said, sure in a vacuum that makes sense, but if you're not going to adapt to the way the world has changed, you're going to flounder and you're going to decline, and
Yeah.
that's
That
really
ultimately was the conflict between Hillary and Trump. And that is, Trump in 2016 wanted to use honey to keep American dollar supremacy going, which made sense. Which made sense. And after the 4 years, like for them, it was unacceptable that Trump was even in office. But his strategy was considered completely wrong. And so this is just, they went for an all or nothing approach with Biden.
Biden was completely mask off, which it is, I suppose, the normie. It would be a strange subversion of expectations that Trump was the carrot and Hillary was the stick. That Trump, despite
Mm.
all of his rhetoric, was the guy who was going to go in and sweet talk you and talk you into staying in the U.S. dollar by making you a tremendous deal. All of his kind of rhetoric. Where Hillary, we all saw what would have happened had she assumed office, that it's going to be now or never. I mean, truthfully, I think just with less mental faculties, and who knows what Hillary would look like at the end of her first term. What we're seeing under Biden is just what was supposed to happen, just delayed by 4 years. That they were going to push the Ukraine issue. If Hillary got into
Yep.
office, they were going to push the Ukraine issue. They were going to push the issue of the Middle East. They were going to open up more aggressive rhetoric towards China. Now, admittedly, Trump did actually break down a lot of the walls when it came to China, but a lot of that was just economic versus actually geopolitical, as because you do see right now a lot of the standoffs. Whereas I'm not saying Trump didn't play that game, but a lot of his rhetoric towards China was purely economic. But what I do think right now is Biden, like you said, was just it's now or never moment. It's what they should have done 4 years ago, what they wanted to do 4 years ago. The reason why they even
Yeah.
let Hillary close to the White House because they knew she would be somebody who would just be completely gloves off with that.
Oh, absolutely. She was Secretary of State in the first Obama term, right? 2009 to early 2013. But then she wasn't, and I often wonder if she did that in order to prepare, for the presidency. I don't know why she was no longer. But that's
I
essentially
don't know. Maybe they wanted to send.
Blinken's position.
Yeah, maybe they
R-
wanted to send Kerry in to sweeten up the Iranians, so they had to put Hillary on the side for a few minutes.
Yeah, yeah, 'cause you saw the kind of glee she had when they destroyed Libya, right? And the kind of vexation and venom that she had towards Russia and Putin, and claimed half of America was working for Putin.
Oh yeah, the entire planning phase of the Maidan happened under her watch. Now, it didn't get carried out until 2013. It didn't carry out until she was out of office. But
Yes,
I
yes,
mean, come on, you're telling me this woman was not speaking to Victoria Nuland almost every day. You're telling me
yes, yes.
let's be realistic about this. That the entire first term was planning a lot of these operations that did come to fruition within Obama's second term, and that Trump, the greatest thing he did was delay all of this by 4 years and
Yeah,
bought some breathing room to the point where the world can look like a more dynamic place, to the point where we aren't possibly going to. I mean, who knows what the future holds now, but he bought us 4 years, 4 extra years of potential war with Russia or any sort of other major escalation. And that's really the best thing you could say about him. And now they're
yeah.
trying to trudge him up against certain factions, and perhaps he may be the preferable option to Biden. At this point, I would have to say, despite everything, I am still leaning towards that opinion. Uh,
Mm,
they want him to implement his own gloves off sort of rhetoric. And like I said, going
yes.
back to his comments with the U.S. dollar, some is very contradictory rhetoric, and then talking about, of course, the tariffs policy he has, which once again, theoretically, I don't oppose the idea of high tariffs, low personal taxation, but given the context in which it would be implemented, we all know where that's going.
Yeah, and Europe is following a similar example with respect to, say, Chinese electric cars. But obviously, Hungary, Serbia, and possibly Slovakia are going to go a different route. That may still anger the Americans and Brussels because they don't like any example of that, if of another system that works, that is successful. and that's also true for Russia, right? But so as long as we're talking about this, we could bring up the on the weekend the news that at the G7 meeting that the 50,000 that Ukraine is going to receive a $50,000 loan, and the guarantors of the loan will of course be the Europeans. It will be the EU, and the money will be generated by the Russian assets, somewhere between 200 to 260 billion, which are in a European bank. And now the crazy thing about this is the interest is only between 1.5 to $3 billion a year on the interest. Now, of course, it's completely illegal, and Putin did mention when he gave his his peace terms, um, that it's still theft. I mean, you can't steal the interest and say, well, I'm not stealing the principal, therefore. It's kind of like that. It's this strange combination that the West, particularly in the last 14 years, this kind of strange kind of moralism and legalism, kind of like, well, you don't understand. Russia is so evil. We have to disobey the law. Kind of like in 2016, we have to break the law because if Trump becomes president, it'll be Hitler. You'll thank me later. Sometimes the rules have to be broken to preserve the peace or whatever. You know what? It's all this kind of thinking, right?
We have to
So
violate our sacred principles in order to uphold our sacred principles. That's the
right,
kind
right.
of
Even though
rhetoric they always
America's
delve
never
into.
done this before, like yes, assets have been frozen, but stealing the interest, blah blah, that hasn't happened.
Well, the question is, what's that going to do investor? I know I'm not the only person to bring this up, but what's that going to do to investor confidence from places like India and China, both of which are economies on the ascent right now? What's that going to do to the
Yeah,
amount of, say, Saudi money within the West as
yeah.
well?
Who's going to invest? You're right. Who's the investor? Because I mean, let's be honest. Ukraine is never going to pay back $50 billion. Ukraine can't even pay back $1 billion, let alone $50 billion. Second of all, Ukraine is going to burn through $50 billion in a year, no more than a year. And the Russian interest based off the frozen assets is at most 3 billion. So like, I mean, obviously what's going to happen is the Europeans will have to pay for it. They won't have the money, so they'll sell all the industry and whatever to America. That's what will happen. And America will have American factories or whatever. They'll own certain, industries in Europe. Kind of in the way that Ukraine right now is selling off something like 20 more percent of all its like federal assets, in order to like balance its books because it's over $20 billion in the hole. So
6 weeks from insolvency if they don't get another aid package.
that's it. Thank you.
And
Yeah.
with all that being said, because we've broached the topic of Europe, I believe it's the 14th sanctions package they just tried to pass failed. And that's because Germany held
Ooh.
out. And this was after the EU Parliament elections and the gains of, particularly in Germany, of the AfD, of the right wing faction. A lot. Once again, the big issues here were migration and economics. Now, the European Parliament doesn't have much formal power, but as I was saying earlier, it's a barometer of public opinion. What this body has, and I the primary issue being immigration. European peoples are tired of endless waves of immigration, and the fact that we're probably looking at a wave that's going to be comparable to say what we saw in 2015. And number two is the economic woes, which are certainly uh, inseparable from the European Union's policy towards Ukraine. So Olaf Scholz's government held out on the consensus that would need to be reached in order to implement the next sanctions package. I believe there's also some elements of holding out in France. I know that France has been a pivotal member in blocking sanctions of uranium and nuclear fuel from Russia just because of their own energy sector and how much it relies on that. Hungary has also been a steadfast country when it comes to opposing sanctions packages and softening the blow on them. And now they're joined by Slovakia as well. And you even get sometimes out of, say, countries like Bulgaria, some tacit opposition depending on the exact issue and the exact sector that they're talking about sanctioning. But this was the first time we really had Germany snake on a sanctions package when they have traditionally, since the beginning of the war, been at the forefront of these sanctions packages. And like I said, the U.S., of course, they're not beholden to European Union rules, of course. They were able to implement theirs, which, as we talked about, tied in the Chinese banks as well. But Europe held out on those, and that
That's I'm so glad you brought. I did not know this. That's fascinating.
now, of course, it got kicked back to the table. They're renegotiating. They're trying to find more amenable terms, but yet another sanctions package was delayed, and that's on top of the aid packages that have been delayed for months, or they haven't had the numbers to meet for months because they can't reach consensus on that as well. But you do get Europe balking at its current Ukraine policy, especially economically speaking. But you are seeing this failure to reach consensus on a Ukraine policy in Europe. And like I said before, it had been these minor states like Hungary, like Slovakia, which of course they do, just because of the structure of the European Union, have the power to stymie these acts. You finally got something out of a major European player that really put a wrench into this. And I think probably the biggest outcome of the European parliamentary elections is the collapse in government confidence in France, leading to a snap election, which it is an interesting move from Macron. I mean, before I get into that, if you have any thoughts on the issue of sanctions and the failure to pass the most recent package, I'll cede the floor to you for a moment.
I mean, it will probably be resolved eventually, but it will also probably take longer than the other hiccups that the EU has had before sanctions. Um, I think they're kind of running out of some options. Some of it might also be a question of let's say escalation. The whole thing with what they did with the stock exchange, right? Like America, Russia had a stock exchange that like dealt with converting foreign money, and the other one was like the ruble. And in the 90s, they merged them together, but there's like a separate office. But anyhow, like so no more euro and no more American dollars and the Russian stock exchange. This impacted the ruble the first few days, but it has bounced back because Russia has prepared for this. There will be issues down the road in the short term, but I think in the medium and long, they'll be ironed out. So I don't know. A lot is being thrown at Russia, and it's not succeeding primarily because it's just too big and important of a player. It is not like Saudi Arabia, where it has great resources, but not a really big population, not doesn't have a lot of military savvy, can't it it has lots of minerals. For instance, India had a bad harvest. Now they're going to Russia for extra food. I mean, how many commodities is Russia in the top five globally? Like, there's dozens and dozens. It's
And
just
then you
too.
get in the top 10, that's even more because, okay, you have oil and
Yeah,
natural gas, you have wheat, you have agricultural products.
fertilizer,
They're one of the few food exporters. Fertilizer, uranium,
uranium,
nuclear fuel, just the entire nuclear
gold.
industry in general. Rosatom has dominated on the global
Yeah.
stage for years. Coal, diamonds. Like I said, there's a number of industries that they excel at that you could continue on. Military hardware, of course, is another one that they also
Yeah.
now because of the situation of the war. There's probably less military exports, but once again, they have the military industry. They have heavy industry. They are a major steel producer. They're not one of the top in the world, but they certainly have a domestic steel industry that they can export to the international market. So there's a number of
Yeah.
raw resources and manufactured goods that this country can put out. It's unless you're going to wage an all-out assault on this country, militarily, economically, culturally, it's you're not going to crack this nut like it's Iraq or Libya or uh, even say if they were to try to go after Iran, it's just not going to happen. This country is
Yeah.
too pivotal that you would need some sort of internal strife in order to take them down, and I think that's of course what they're aiming at. The war in Ukraine is only part of that, but it's and when it comes to the sanctions package, it's one of those things where they've isolated themselves at this point enough from Western economies where they can bear the loss from the sanctions. And as a matter of fact, it actually backfires in the West to the point where they deprive themselves from this major market for all of these resources and these goods. And the economic arrangement for Europe with Russia for the past 20 years up until this war started was Russian heavy industry and raw resources cooperates with more high tech, precise German industry, and it's they feed off each other. Now, the
Yeah.
thing is, when it comes to high tech and precise industries, Germany is not the only country in the world that they can cooperate with. China, while I would say not nearly as advanced as Germany, has been excelling at the more precise high tech industry as well.
Yeah.
And like I said, there's a number of different countries they could cooperate with it in that regard. But they have the heavy industry, and that's something that they've
Hmm.
had even since before the Soviet Union that they've excelled at is the heavy industry. And you're not going to displace a country that could, under a worst case scenario, function as an autarky. This is a country that now living standards would be much worse, the quality of life would be much worse. But if push came to the shove, if this country really was isolated, it would be able to sustain itself for far longer than most nations could. And
Yeah, I will say something from experience. And, as a photographer, one of the things that have seen a trend in the last 4 or 5 years is the Chinese are manufacturing like lenses for cameras. I suppose digital even film with some Nikons in some instances, but mostly for digital, particularly mirrorless. These lenses are constructed like so. When I shot film, I shot with like very old Nikon and Leica, and there's a certain way that those products that were created in the 60s and early and even up until the like late 70s, mid 70s, they're so substantial. And when you pick up like most of these Chinese brands now, that's how they're made. They're made like the way Japanese made lenses, imitating the Germans. That's how solid they are. And they're performing very well. Like every year, they get better and better. Um, so, there's a certain acuity to what they can do produce optically. Like there's many fields where they're advancing. It's almost like it's kind of like how the people didn't take the Japanese seriously in the 40s, 50s, and 60s. I'm not kidding you. People even laughed at the Germans, right? But by the 80s, it was obvious they were producing better products than the Americans. And that just went right on the way through. And I'm just saying that that's one of the things that I notice happening with the Chinese. But this has been a night of just be derailing Constantine. I'm sorry.
no, no, that's why this show works because you actually have thoughts on what I say, and it's not just inane babbling. But no, I'm glad you brought that up, and that we are seeing something similar to where China, which has for decades been viewed as just a hub for cheap manufacturing of cheap products, and I'm speaking both quality and price, is becoming a more precise, more high tech economy, something that does make a name for itself over the years. And I think the comparison you make from Japan from say the 60s to the 80s and 90s, I think it's apt in that we may be seeing a similar path take place with that. And I suppose
Hmm.
what we will have to see, especially as Chinese economic growth does continue, as their relevance in the world does continue to grow, what they're actually capable of, because they are in.
Even the Economist had a story about how Huawei is completely recovered and is thriving right now. So just something to think about.
Oh, absolutely. And it does have these competitor industries. It's not just manufacturing Western products anymore. So this country is becoming beyond just. I know a lot of people focused on the middle income trap. Is China ever going to be able to get out of it? This does look like a country that's actually being able to chart its own course at this point. And like I said, we'll see what the future holds for them. But it does look like beyond just a manufacturing hub that they are defining their economy, which is very interesting to see happen in real time. But with all that being said, going back to Europe, Macron has called a snap election. Now,
Mm.
just a brief on the French political system. I'm sure most of you already know this, but just to give brief details for anyone who might not be familiar. It's a what they call a semi-presidential system, where the president is the head of state. He wields most of the executive power. Of course, it being a quote-unquote democracy, beholden to the legislature in order to actually get any sort of action done. But there also is a parallel parliamentary system where the parliament, once it's elected, appoints prime minister who serves under the president, who serves in the president's cabinet, and that's you actually a lot of times get where the president and the prime minister are of opposing political parties, uh, and it's not just ceremonial president, say, as you might get in some of the parliamentary republics in Europe, like Germany or like Poland or Italy, for example. But no, this is an executive office that actually wields significant political power, especially in France. France is a very strong executive office. So, after the success of the right wing coalition in France, uh, Macron called a snap election. Now, there's speculation as to why this happened. I think the most plausible explanation is Paris, of course, won the Olympic bid that they're going to be hosting that in about a month's time. So this is going to diffuse a lot of political tensions because it's giving people the, uh, let's just say, the catharsis of having their voice heard, quote unquote, by bringing that to the ballot box on a national level. And also, I've heard speculation with some of the internal politics that's gone on. It has caused a bit of a fraction of the right from the National Rally, Le Pen's party, and then uh, Zemmour has returned to French politics. He's trying his own right wing movement, and that there's really no consensus having been reached between those parties yet. You have the French Republican Party, which is I I don't want to say the legacy of De Gaulle because it doesn't do him justice, but they purport to have the legacy of De Gaulle on their side. They're the center right party, which has been floundering for a number of years. Of course, isn't going to reach consensus with either of the right wing factions. Where you have the center and the left, center and the center left, I should say, generally in line on the issue. So, I mean, the two reasons I can think why Macron did this is to cause infighting on the French right wing after their moment of ascendancy, and also to diffuse any sort of political tensions or demonstrations in the lead up to what's supposed to be his grandstanding event with being the Olympic host. Because despite the past few decades, it still does carry a great amount of prestige globally. Having an event like that, like I said, it's nowhere near what it used to be, but there is still some prestige to be gained from that. And Macron is also about halfway through his, just under halfway through his second term, which he's term limited. So I think he's really going for legacy with that, especially, and of course a lot of the Ukraine stuff as well, and just his conduct in general. But it does look like he's trying to diffuse political tensions, but I suppose in a way it could look like a concession, but also makes him look like a quote unquote fair player. I'm not going to say it's the most odd move in the world, but like I said, I think it is mostly to create the catharsis of voting, despite the fact that's not really going to make much of a difference in the first place as it is. But um, with that being said, it I mean, although the European Parliament, like I said, wields very real little power, just seeing the shift in public opinion in Europe, I knew that there was going to be discontent with the establishment. Of course, there was going to be with how pathetically mismanaged the past 2 years, especially, have been. But it actually exceeded my expectations.
Mhm. Yeah, I mean, okay, I don't fully understand this, and I know our listeners in Europe will like just say how pathetic GSP is. But is okay, if I understand correctly, the EU cannot write like the Parliament, the EU Parliament cannot write laws for each separate individual country, right? And like
To my understanding,
Macron
correct.
losing it, right? And they can't enforce it either per se. It doesn't mean they can't do sanctions, the kind of stuff that they're doing with Hungary, for instance, right? Um, but as far as I understand, um, like this could explain maybe a little bit of what or define what Macron was thinking in calling a snap election. Because as I understood some of the podcasts that I've been listening to, no one in France expected this. This is a real, I mean, it's a rarity. And it's not France has a presidential system, not a parliamentary one. So um, I guess what I'm trying to get at is the EU Parliament doesn't necessarily like mean the end, right? Macron loses, and therefore he has to step down. Far from it, right? The same thing goes for Schultz, although all of them performed very poorly. Sunak is another. Oh well, no, I mean Sunak is a different story. Britain's not in the EU, but um, I'm just saying that Britain is moving towards an election on July the 4th. Yeah, no message there. Uh, no hint. So um, I guess these EU elections are a kind of a bellwether, right? I think all the effort that they've put in against populist movements, which coincided since the 2015 migrant crisis, right? That's where AFD. That's where it got. That's how it was born. Maybe it's a bellwether, and they're thinking like, this is the time for me to get out. Uh, you know, with Macron, maybe not. With Macron, maybe he thinks like, if I catch everybody off guard, then I can probably win this. But a lot of people are saying, um, including some people I respect, are saying no way. Le Pen is going to take this one. So interesting.
I don't see a scenario in which, even if the right is fractured, that this plays to Macron's favor. And that, in a way, I do think it looks like a concession because it is. It's something that
Mm-hmm.
because of his low popularity, because of the poor performance in of his party, even just on a level of the European Parliament, reflects poorly on domestic politics as well, which forces his hand on this issue. That's my general take on it. Now, with that being said, I suppose we can go on to some of the news out of the UK with the complete implosion of the Tory party after
Yes.
14 years of unmitigated rule, unmitigated disaster. Many of the most left wing policies in the UK's history have been passed under the Tory party, that being mass migration, gay marriage, to name a few.
Yeah.
Uh, the complete ignoring of crime waves from said mass migration also occurring under the so called conservatives, the so called right wing. But it's just been a complete floundering. This is not a party that can really sell itself anymore. You look at the polls, Labor is set to win in a landslide. And I mean, I can't even tell you the first thing about Keir Starmer. That's how irrelevant this guy is.
Yeah. Yeah.
For the longest time, I forgot that they even kicked Jeremy Corbyn out, and I thought he was still in charge of it, which would be very funny in context of the whole Israel Palestine thing, having him in power. But unfortunately, that's not going to happen. They're not going to let that happen because that's the one issue he's too transgressive on. But I know that Farage has made his, I think this is now fourth return to national politics with the Reform UK party, in which case they seem to be vulturing a lot of votes from the Conservatives to the point where they might actually displace them electorally, and that we could be looking at the complete implosion of the Tory party on any sort of significant political level. I don't think the Liberal Democrats, which has always just been the wedge party in the UK, UK's, I guess you could call it a two and a half party system, where one of two is going to win, but you just have that one stickler in there. Kind of like, I suppose, speaking to your nation, the New Democratic Party, just that annoying stickler, just that's never going to win, but still manages to win enough seats in order to stay relevant. Even though I mean, I shouldn't say that because, like I said, it does look like the Tory party is possibly on the path of complete implosion. I've heard a lot of people on the right actually make a case for this because, number one, we've seen what 14 years of conservative rule has delivered in the UK, anything but conservatism, even in its most mild sense, that it has been liberal, if not outright leftist government. And I mean, just once again, look at all the things that have happened in the UK under the so-called right wing. This is, and I don't even think they consider themselves, they even openly label themselves all as right wing insofar as that term has any meaning to anyone listening right here. But like I said, I know a lot of the more generally right wing elements have defected to reform, which is, I guess you could say, just more of the broad right wing populism. Nothing that you can look at with too much contempt, but you can also admit is wholly insufficient, but certainly beats the alternative right now.
Yeah.
I would, like I said, what they propose, and you read some of their platforms, it's it's weak compared to what you would want, but um, it makes they look like a godsend compared to the Tories. I'll just put it that way. Judging on my understanding of UK politics, which, insofar as European politics is concerned, the UK is actually one of my more blind spots. I know a lot more about, say, the French, the Italian, or the German system when it comes to electoral politics in Europe, but I digress. But it does look like it's going to be a blowout for the Labour Party, and I'm not saying that things are going to get any better. It's just going to be a more accelerated version of the past 14 years of disaster, and they're just going to keep pushing these issues. And of course, being on the left, they're going to be a lot more insufferable about it, as we all know. But uh, I do think that seeing the um, one of the major political parties in the West fall into complete irrelevance, I'd say I support it wholeheartedly. And I mean, you can even make a case in the U.S. that the Republicans have some value, and I hate to even say that, but you can make the case that they have some stopping power. In the
Right. And
UK,
this is the oldest political
yeah,
party in the world.
yeah, the oldest political party in the world, but but the Conservatives in the UK, I don't think you can conceivably make that argument. Like I said, you could possibly make that for the Conservatives, say in the other parts of the Anglosphere, Canada, Australia, etc. You can make that case for some of the establishment right wing parties on the continent. But like I said, in the UK, I think that they probably have the weakest argument to be made for them. In which case, let them be sentenced to the dustbin of history. Good riddance. And yeah,
Hmm.
look, I'm fully behind the whole zero seats thing that's been going around, and I can't wait to see it. Look, I'm not British. I won't have to deal with the first-hand consequences of this, so I understand if there's any apprehension here. But my opinion that I've garnered from British people on the right, I mean, they're welcoming this. I would say even more so than the than the left wing, than the Labour Party is, and that the Labour Party is actually a little bit concerned because it does destroy the illusion of democracy. The fact that this strong center right party that's supposed to play controlled opposition is just going to evaporate to what might look like a maybe not genuine right wing resistance, but a much more right wing resistance than what they've had to put up with in a number of decades. And I know that when you go into all the literature about how to prevent right wing authoritarianism, one of the things they always point to is that have a neutered center right party, and that's the best thing you could do. Just let them push the needle left while the people think that they're under a conservative rule, which is what's been happening for the past 70 years in the West, as we all
Yeah.
know. But like I said, if that system, if their controlled opposition parties completely fail, I can be nothing but happy about that.
Yeah. One of the things that has become clear, particularly following German politics, about um, forming coalitions, and because one of the fallouts of these EU parliamentary elections is the Greens have lost support. Remember that the Greens, back when Schultz took over, they gained seats, and they've been sort of going. That's where that's Annalena Baerbock, right? That's her party, and we did a show back in May 2021 where she meets up with before she's a member of um, German Parliament, if you will. She meets up with Blinken, and you can tell that she's been groomed by the American elites. These are the kind of people that they want in for the next phase of Americanization of Europe, and she's a candidate for this. So um, one that Blinken is essentially impressed with. That's why she was featured on CSIS. If it wasn't CSIS, then it was the Atlantic Council. One of those two, May 2021. So yeah, I would say that that has been for them has been a cause for concern, because like you mentioned the zero seats. Of course, it was Academic Agent who came up with that hashtag. As far as I know, I think RT, Russia Today, the Russian government media outlet, did a story on him, because it gained so much popularity. Zero seats it's so good. Like, I think it encapsulates the anger that so many Britons have, but particularly with the Tories. And I think this isn't going to be like 97. Like, Keir Starmer is obviously going to win, and the Tories are going to get crushed.
So no
And
more
it's
Tony Blair. Oh no.
no, Tony Blair's eternal. But um, Keir Starmer will be the first. He may not admit it, but he'll be the first to understand that this was a protest vote. This wasn't like the Britons in 97 reimagining their future, and getting rid of the Tories and all that. I it will not be, neither for Britons nor for Keir Starmer will this feel like 1997, nor for the Labour Party. They're all well aware. They will spin it a different way, particularly Labour, but it will not. That's not what this is about.
No, not at all. They know full well that the conservatives are losing and they're not winning.
Yeah, it's
Yeah,
it's disgust. It's absolute disgust.
that they're going to win not by their own supporters but by voter apathy. That's
That's right.
and that's what's going to come out to. I am curious to see how low turnout in this election is, because I know like I had said earlier, you have Reform, you have these other alternative right wing parties popping up right now, but I feel like most people who would have otherwise voted conservative are just going to sit this one out, and that's just going to be
Oh yeah.
what the majority of them do. So it's going to be an election of apathy. Who knows how this will change the internal politics of the Conservative Party? Perhaps we won't get the implosion that a lot of people are say even hoping for, but who knows what kind of internal reform within the party that will lead to? I doubt anything. I doubt they would learn their lesson from this. That they'll probably just double down and keep decaying at the rate they are, and hopefully being replaced by a more suitable alternatives. And look, I know that Farage, very entertaining figure, and I can't dislike him. I'll put it that way, but he doesn't have a good track record with keeping these political movements alive past their expiration date. Now I know UKIP was around for a while, but once the Brexit vote happened, the party imploded. He went on to one of the other parties he'd started. But like I said, these things don't have a very long shelf life, so I don't know. Maybe reform will be the exception, but I don't foresee it.
Yeah, I tend to agree with you on that. Yeah.
And I mean that's really all I had for the UK elections. We're about 3 weeks out, so we'll see the results of that in the next few weeks. Of course, inside of Britain, not much is going to change. It's just going to be a more formalization of everything that's been happening the past 14 years under a, let's just say, a face that's able to rally much more opposition to him. So I don't know. Hopefully that reinvigorates the right in some sense in order to take actual beneficial action for their country. But we'll have to wait and see for that to happen. But we are dwelling a little bit on European politics, and
Mm-hmm.
we are coming
Mm-hmm.
up a little bit on time. I don't want to drag this show out too
Yeah.
long, so
Yeah.
I will just lightning round some stuff and then go on to the Israel news out of the Middle East. So first off, just the little issue I wanted to get out of the way is Pashinyan has completely withdrawn from the CTSO and has completely turned his back on the West. And, excuse me, completely turned his back on Russia and is looking towards the West now. As the tensions in the region grow, as Azerbaijan becomes more and more emboldened, Pashinyan has left. I know there were some murmurs from some Armenian military officers who expressed something that could have been construed as pro-Russian sympathy, but I don't want to read too much into that for the time being. But Armenia has solidified its divorce with the Russian bloc, with the
Yeah.
CSTO, and I only foresee negative consequences coming from that. That the West is not going to bail Armenia out of their next crisis situation, and that they'll be forced to make more concessions to the Turks and to the Azeris. And I don't know, perhaps they are trying to build that Transcaucasian corridor in order to open that front up to the west. I mean, but at the same time, this is also after Georgia has more or less capitulated, and after the Georgians have appointed an ambassador to Russia. And while relations aren't anywhere close to, say, warm and friendly, they are cooperative nations. They do have strong economic relations at this point now, and it does look like relations are starting to become normalized. And perhaps we'll see a more formalized solution to South Ossetia and Abkhazia because of that. But I mean, what Russia lost to Armenia, it's more than made up with if relations with Georgia continue to improve. I'll just put it that way.
Yeah, I mean, this is crazy because last week, after he announced that, it came out that he had also said that there should be even more territory that should be ceded to the Azerbaijanis. And I'm not tooting my own horn, but you know, uh, last year, or might have been in January of this year, I said, like, he's doing all of this in order to get in the EU. And that's what it seems like is happening, because part of the reason I think Georgia is emboldened, they passed that foreign agents law very successfully. Now they're passing, basically anti-LGBTQ degenerate stuff. Um, and I said that was from a position of strength. Why would, like, that doesn't sound like a country that's afraid of America or afraid of what America might do as a result, and of the step that they've taken. So I guess Pashinyan has been promised the stars and the moon. Look, we need you. We're losing Georgia. You're going to be our man in the Caucasus. Who knows? They might even say, "Well, you'll get this back. All this land you've lost, someday you'll get it back." I mean, I'm just throwing it out there, but you can bet from Pashinyan saying he wants to work with the West, as it were, and getting leaving the CTO and so on. Yeah, that's why he's doing this. That's why he's conceding all this land to the Azerbaijanis. That's the price.
The complete cession of national sovereignty on any level
Yeah.
is the price that you have to pay for cooperation with the West. And I mean, the Armenians, they had the chance to end this war in '92. They could have solved this issue for the foreseeable future, but unfortunately, they did not pursue that path. They went down the path of color revolution, and this is the consequence that they had to pay as a nation. And I think this is all the more stark contrast, as we said, with Georgia and with their mending of relations with Russia, and the opposite directions in which those nations are going. And I mean, there's not really much more
Yeah,
you can put to that. And of course, the Azeris have navigated their position spectacularly. They are an energy hub. They uh, receive aid from the West because of their border with the Iranians. They're even able to get aid from Israel, of all countries, and because of their proximity to the Iranians as well. And like I said, major energy hub and a very friendly relation with Turkey. This is a country that love them or hate them, and I'll be honest, I'm not the biggest fan of them. Has masterfully played their position, and there's really not much more you can say about that.
yeah.
Um, but moving on to the last topic I want to cover tonight, Netanyahu's political prospects are failing day by day because this weekend Tel Aviv was rocked with protests, massive crowds in the street demanding a ceasefire to the war. Those anti-Semites out there in Tel Aviv demanding a ceasefire. Who would have thought? And the immediate prisoner exchange with Hamas for the hostages to return home. Now, I'm not saying this represents a majority of public opinion in Israel, but war weariness is setting in. And now you have Netanyahu having dismissed his war cabinet
Yeah.
and is only going to deal with direct advisors when it comes to the war because he's spurned so much capital with the cabinet that he had, which was a coalition cabinet, and Netanyahu's political prospects were only in power because of the coalition agreements that he did have to make to return to power. He has sidelined all of his wartime ministers and is more or less seized, and I mean this in the most literal sense, not even pejorative sense, dictatorial control of the country, especially when it comes to the prosecution of this war effort. And returning to history legends, he also put an interesting video over the weekend about Israel's casualty counts, which,
Oh yeah, that was quite
yeah,
good.
which, according to the numbers, speculates about 300 KIA with about uh, 12 to 1600 others either wounded or by some other means
And that's not the
taken
ones
out of the
that
battle.
died on October the
No,
7th.
yeah, this is in the
On
campaigns
top of that.
since. Yeah,
Yeah.
that's on top of the casualties from October 7th, both civilian and military alike. But anywhere from 12 to 1600 who are casualties from injury or any other event that would have taken them out of the battlefield, and we've seen the stalling out of progress in the in the Gaza Strip. And once again, to give credit to History Legends because it's a very good video. Like I said, he's very good at the number crunching. He goes through all of that. If we were to extrapolate that to U.S. numbers, that is if the U.S. were to embark on a military campaign and lose 13,000 men, uh, just
Jeez,
uh,
pretty
just
sizable,
adjusted
right?
for population. So that's bigger than anything that we had in either Iraq or Afghanistan after 20 years of war. Of course, somewhere close to the 60,000 that the U.S. Casualties taken in Vietnam, but it would be the first time we broke 10,000 in a conflict in a number of decades if we were in that hypothetical scenario. But this is the military situation Israel finds itself in. Uh, of course, terror bombing campaigns of Gaza do continue, but those do little to actually root out the militant fighters of Hamas. More so, just drive the civilians into cordoned off zones, into refugee sectors, which of course also end up getting bombed, as we've seen over the past few months here. The border with Egypt remains closed, and now you have Hezbollah increasing operations against the IDF to the point where it was one of the fortified sections of the border between Israel and Lebanon where the Israelis built a trebuchet in order to launch projectiles at Hezbollah positions because that was the corner that they had been backed into. And that was. I still don't understand the exact logic of why they need to sling projectiles at Hezbollah versus conventional weapons, but it was an odd sight to see. You do get these very antiquated military technologies that come up every once in a while. I mean, I think the border disputes between India and China are probably the premier example of this, where they've forged spears and swords because they can't open fire on each other because they're officially unarmed. And you'll get these skirmishes where dozens of people die on these mountainous border regions between India and China, and both countries just overlook the issue and let them skirmish and let them brawl, and it has no effect on no substantial effect on their relations. But I obviously the situation between Israel and Hezbollah is much more substantial than Indian Chinese border disputes. But you do have Hezbollah picking up operations in northern Israel, striking targets there, and and the the operational capability of Israel is waning day by day. And I know we talked about the opening of the northern front, some of the potential for expansion into Syria and Lebanon. It does look like that they haven't pursued that, but that Hezbollah and other Iranian-backed groups and other Iranian-aligned groups are continuing attacks into northern Israel. And once again, probably the biggest effect of those attacks isn't anything military or tactically. It's a wavering of confidence in the Israeli government to secure the position of its civilian population. The idea that these people in northern Israel, in these contested regions, aren't going to feel secure, aren't going to feel like they can rely on their government in order to secure their homestead. And especially when it comes to, say, the settlers in the West Bank, if you were to have any issue there, that would be a massive blow in confidence if you were to get any sort of armed uprising in the West Bank, if you were to get some sort of outbreak there. But the main thing that's been happening, and even with the continued uh, conflict with Hamas, is it erodes the confidence of the Israeli government, which, as we've seen since October 7th, has led to at least I don't know what the immigration figures were that, but I know there were tens of thousands of immigrants from Israel since October 7th.
Oh, from the north alone, 60,000. Interestingly, you brought up history legend video on casualty, and he had basically December, like October, December, and January were the worst months for the Israelis, and they kind of got a grip on it. They've reduced, the amount of casualties, but um, yesterday, for instance, the Israelis confirmed that Hamas did kill 11 of its fighters. The claims came pretty early. They said they killed 12. Then there was a claim that it was 8, but then Israel finally admitted that it was indeed 11. Part of the reason for this is the the infantry fighting vehicles that the Israelis use are really big. They're like, I don't know. To me, they seem bigger than the American Striker. So they hold like nobody's riding out on top of it like the way the Russians and the Ukrainians do. Uh, so, it's basically that got hit and everybody inside died. Um, and that makes you think, how much has Hamas really been depleted? That I'm not so sure that they have. You know, um, like when they talk about we discovered them communicating. From what I understand, Gaza's not that big. I think it's only like what 10 miles each way.
Yeah, it's a
They
sliver of land.
It's a sliver of land. It's only 2-3 miles wide and it's like 10 miles long at the most. Uh, the thing is according to Alistair Crook, the way they get their messages done is so unless they're talking to the outside world, not between themselves. What they're doing is they have guys on bicycles that ride underneath in these tunnels that are over 70 feet deep. And that's what they do. That's how they deliver their messages. Crazy,
Yeah,
but yeah.
yeah. Like I said, you can talk about the immense damage Israel is doing to the Gaza Strip right now, but none of that is even in service of any greater strategic goal. It is just a terror bombing campaign. That's really the only way you can put it. Um, and after all of that, they have failed to uproot Hamas in the Gaza Strip. and they've also failed to take any action against any Hamas leaders and sponsors abroad because they know what a massive escalation that would be. Look, there are a lot of Hamas leaders and Hamas affiliates in places like Qatar and the United Arab Emirates, a lot of them
Hmm.
living abroad, that conceivably the Israelis could have a Mossad operation that either captures or eliminates them. But the political capital that would take and the amount of tensions that would rise in the region if they were to just send assassins to take out these leaders, that's not a price they're willing to pay at this point, it seems. And not to mention, of course, it's convenient for Netanyahu to have this perpetual war, and it's also convenient for them to have mass emigration from the Gaza Strip because it is yet another area they do plan on settling after this war is over. If they get their way, if they are able to uproot the population there, which they have ample plans to, they've discussed
Yeah.
this at length. They're going to try to move settlers into this land and formally annex it, like they've annexed many of the settlements in the West Bank, and that's the exact plan they have. And love or hate Hamas, and you can talk about their connection to the Muslim Brotherhood or wherever. We saw what happened when the PLO disarmed and entered into formal negotiations with Israel.
Hmm.
Has the West Bank expanded, or have they lost
Hmm.
territory?
Right. Right.
And even those who maybe weren't sympathetic to the ideological or religious leanings of Hamas have been more or less forced to rally behind the flag when it comes to them in the Gaza Strip because it's either Hamas or it's Israel, and that's the position that they have been left in. And I mean, I know it's an umbrella organization that there are other groups operating in the Gaza Strip, but it that's what it has come down to. And uh, of course, Israel at this point has a blank check. They'll get the occasional finger wagging from some Western countries, but their main sponsors are just going to tolerate. I mean, I know we talked about Ukraine earlier. As long as it takes. Well, it looks like that logic was transferred from Israel, from Ukraine to Israel, and that Israel is going to get aid for as long as it takes, and that they're going to continue this campaign. While it's a blight on everyone else's record, even if you want to, and look, I'm not trying to be a bleeding heart here, but it is damaging when it comes to international reputation. There's a reason the Houthis still have the Red Sea as a shooting gallery because of
Yes.
the situation. This is the price. This is the price we pay for Israel's expansionist goals. The fact that we can't even move trade through the Red Sea anymore, and then
Yeah, you thought it
they
was
will
just no health care.
then they will lecture us on the strategic imperative of Israel as an ally in the region when look, even if you support the American empire, I'll make this appeal to you. I'll play devil's advocate. What is this country doing for you except shooting you in the foot at every given opportunity? What is this country doing for you except expending your reputation at every given opportunity? What has attaching yourself to the Semitic statelet gained for you?
Yeah.
Absolutely nothing. Like I said, if you want to talk complete pragmatism, if you think America should maintain its current position in the world, Israel has to be cut off. This country, and I'm not even saying you have to, do away with the entire state of Israel, but Israel in its current military efforts has to be cut off. And somebody, some American diplomat, some successor to Henry Kissinger, has to sit these people down and say, "You can't keep doing this. Okay, we're trying to save you from yourselves." And that if you continue on this, you're going to not only burn your own reputation, but the reputation of your main guarantor, that being us, in which case nobody's going to win. So you're going to have to suck it up. You're going to have to make some sort of soft peace with your neighbors. You're going to have to stop provoking conflict. You're going to have to come to some sort of terms to exist relatively peacefully with your neighbors. Otherwise, you're going to drag this whole system down. And look, I know there's other factors that are creating an immense amount of strain on the American empire. Don't get me wrong, I'm not ignorant to that. But this is just yet another unnecessary stressor on the American empire that, even, like I said, the most jingoistic supporter of the American empire has to look at this project and say, this is doing nothing for us except hindering us.
Mhm.
And I don't think there's anyone, at least with a large enough voice to matter in Washington, who either is willing to take that position or is even aware of that position. It's blank check for Israel is the uniparty position. You'll get some token uh, cries about humanitarianism, but ultimately it all ends with support of Israel. And like I said, this is to nothing but our detriment, and uh, they will continue. this country, if allowed to, will escalate this Gaza conflict into
Oh,
a
if it
regional,
could.
if not global conflict. And if they had the capability, they would. That is how monomaniacal they are about this goal here, that they're willing to let the entire world quite literally burn if it means gaining another inch of the Gaza Strip.
Yeah, yeah.
And that's the appeal I'll make to people who don't even care about the Palestinian cause. Let's say you have nothing but contempt for the Palestinians and are glad Israel's doing that. Okay, I'm going to concede that ground to you for the sake of devil's advocate. But even if you hold that view, is it worth letting Israel potentially escalate this into a global conflict? Like I said, over a few inches of the Gaza Strip.
Yeah, obviously the bigger issue is how do these people live on this sliver of land when, like, I mean, even before October 7th, something like 60% of Jews in Israel believe that the Palestinians should just be expelled, right? But they don't act like expelled people. They don't. Now, I heard something very interesting, claimed not by, I don't know if it was Scott Ritter or not, but it was about 5, 6 days ago. And that was that, this 7 to 800,000 Palestinians that are missing from the Gaza Strip. Where did they go? And he said, well, they're in Gaza. And what happened to them? Well, they starved to death, and nobody knows about it, or nobody's talking about it. I mean, I hope it's not true,
Oh no! And like I said,
but I can't imagine like that would go silent because, like, you brought up the PLO, right? And you know, I don't know what the PLO would have done if it did not adopt, that kind of left wing, socialist, nationalist, Ba'athist bent, right? Um, that was very popular post World War II. And it was, popular in Syria, Algeria. If they had gone the route of Hamas, they probably would have had some begrudging support from, well, Saudi Arabia, Qatar, and so on. You see Israel Iran willing to support them even more so. But I could that many people have starved to death wandering around in the Sinai, and like even these other countries don't bring it up? I just don't believe that.
no, and I think even just speaking purely opportunistically, there's some faction that would have brought this up
Yeah.
because if the rumors are true, and I have no reason to believe or disbelieve them, I have no reason to say definitively one way or another. The Egyptian army is growing weary with the situation in Israel.
Mm.
And despite Sisi's attempts at moderation, I know that there has been escalations, there has been buildups along the border with Gaza with the Egyptian military, and that if rumors are to be believed, which, like I said, I have no way to confirm nor deny, there are itchy trigger fingers in Egypt right now. I don't think it'll spill over. I think that would require a massive political shift that would certainly require the removal of Sisi from power if anything like that were to happen.
Hmm.
But I do think that beyond the restraint of political leaders in the region, um, on a military level, on a paramilitary level, there are a lot of itchy trigger fingers in the Middle East right now on Israel's border, and um, all it takes is and perhaps one might say, well, they've done nothing so far, so of course they're just going to stand by and let it continue. But I don't know, it just takes one wayward shot over, say, the Egyptian border for a round fired by the Israelis, a airstrike conducted by the Israelis to accidentally land in the Sinai and, I don't know, hit an Egyptian soldier, hit an Egyptian position, in order for the situation to inflame. Now, could that be smoothed over properly? But as Israel becomes more belligerent and unhinged with this, as the um, as they continue to escalate this war effort, the more risk they run of turning this into a regional, which will later almost certainly become a global conflict. As I said before,
Mhm.
that if they could, if they had the political capital to get away with this, they're willing to let the whole world burn in order to accomplish this very petty goal, all things considered.
Right, right. But they see. I wonder how much of it is really a question of. I guess for them, they believe it's a question of survival. But for other people, the, let's say that are part of this tribe, um, many of them feel like they have a right to. They don't understand like why they don't have a right to rule, or certain some of these countries, right? Um, I mean, I don't know. It's an interesting dynamic, um, where they feel safer. And I mean, obviously, America. I still do not believe that America is going to get involved in some world-shifting war just for the sake of Israel.
Oh no.
They're going to bend. They're really, really going to bend, and they have bent excessively more. Biden has bent more than um, any U.S. president ever. I mean, he I can't. I simply don't know any U.S. president that has done more for Israel. Uh, even Trump, even though they practically worship Blumph, like
Yeah, the Trump
you know,
Heights.
Trump, yeah. But remember the Trump the Trump coin, and like he was like Cyrus.
Oh yeah, the commemorative coin for the Abraham Accords, which later fell apart.
Yeah. I mean, if that's not like, I don't know, if that doesn't like in many ways describe like just the current situation with America, with the West. I don't know what does, honestly. Like that's hilarious. That's some funny shit, you know.
Oh, absolutely. Yeah, there's no other way around that. Yeah, I remember the Abraham Accords when Saudi Arabia and Israel were finally going to make a proper peace before they
Yeah.
were able to break through with relations with the Iranians, which turned out to be much more profitable, much more pragmatic. I mean, yeah, it's funny that that was like one of Trump's last major acts was trying to force like some half-hearted peace agreement, and then also getting both Serbia and Kosovo to move their embassy to Jerusalem was also his other crowning diplomatic achievement. That was supposedly supposed to bring peace to the Balkans. Yeah, that man, that
Yeah, it's
that
just
end of
crazy.
2020 there was not a good time. That's
Yeah.
yeah, that was ridiculous. But that's all I had for this episode. And if you have anything last minute,
Um, I always probably do, but I just can't think of it right now.
no new
Oh,
Aristowich
here's
news.
what I was. Yes, I do actually. So I don't know if I mentioned this on the show last week. I think I did. I did do a cast with Dimitri from World War Now. So go check it out, please. And I think that was a really great episode that we did, and very happy with the way that turned out. And then this weekend, I don't know if people, my arch nemesis Romanos, as you know, he introduced me to what is it, the Logos by what's his name? Uh, Harry is his last name.
Uh,
I'm
it,
gonna.
it escapes me at the moment.
You know which one I mean,
Yeah, I
right?
think
Something
so. Yeah.
Church of the Eternal Logos, I think, is what it's called. Anyways, the guys from Conrad and Dimitri were on the show this weekend. Great episode. Fascinating episode. Highly recommend people catch it when they have time to do so. So that's all I'll
Certainly.
say.
Well, thank you everyone for tuning in to this most recent episode of the War Report. I'm sure we'll be back with more soon enough. And we'll see you guys next time, and goodbye.
Goodbye and take care.